March 1945. A medieval town near Würzburg, Germany. Gray smoke rises from a massive mound of shattered limestone and splintered oak. An old man stands in the dust, staring at the empty space where an 800-year-old cathedral stood only hours ago. The destruction is absolute, the rubble still warm to the touch. This was not the result of a stray artillery shell or a misplaced bombing raid. Heavy engineering explosives were placed by hand inside the ancient nave, tearing down the spires and turning 6 centuries of irreplaceable stained glass into fine-colored powder. The destruction serves no tactical purpose. There are no snipers here, no observation posts, and no ammunition caches. It is an act of pure, calculated spite. General George S. Patton is about to discover this ruin, and his response will guarantee that the man who ordered it faces the evidence no order could erase. What Patton did when he found an 800-year-old cathedral deliberately blown up by a retreating SS officer. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the evidence no order could erase. Father Heinrich Weber was 68 years old. For 4 decades, he had lived and served in the same quiet parish near Würzburg. He had baptized the town's children, buried its dead, and preserved the meticulous leather-bound registries that tracked 800 years of local human life. He had watched the Weimar Republic fracture, the Third Reich rise, and the bombs fall across Germany. Yet he believed the heavy stone walls of his cathedral would outlast the madness of the current regime. He was a man whose entire existence was anchored to the altar, the ancient stained glass, and the spiritual continuity of his community. When the retreating military vehicles began roaring through the cobblestone streets, he stayed at his post to protect the sanctuary, never imagining that the greatest threat to the sacred structure would come from a man wearing a German uniform. SS Sturmbannführer Konrad Müller was 36 years old. Born into a wealthy family in Berlin, he wore a tailored black uniform, polished leather boots, and a gleaming iron cross that he believed elevated him above ordinary humanity. He held a fanatical devotion to the scorched earth directives issued from the capital, operating under the absolute conviction that if the Reich could not possess Europe, the enemy must inherit nothing but ashes and ruins. He looked upon centuries of art, architecture, and historical records with utter contempt, viewing them as useless relics of an obsolete civilizational consciousness. Before arriving in the medieval town, he had already ordered the methodical demolition of a historic library, a local courthouse, and a venerable monastery during his unit's hasty retreat. He moved through the region with a team of trained demolition specialists and crates of high-grade military explosives, determined to erase every trace of cultural identity before the American vanguard arrived. By the spring of 1945, the collapse of the German Western Front was accelerating by the hour. The Allied armies had shattered the defensive lines along the Rhine, and armored columns were slashing deep into the heart of the German mainland, bypassing major cities to trap entire armies in vast pockets. In this environment of total military defeat, the infrastructure of the collapsing state began to fracture completely. Communication lines were severed, supply lines disappeared, and local government units dissolved into chaotic panic. This breakdown left a vacuum where fanatical officers could operate without the traditional constraints of military oversight or centralized command structure. In many sectors, retreating forces simply abandoned their positions, leaving towns intact to save their own skin, a reality that many Allied commanders had grown to expect as they advanced through the fragmented territory. Other officers, however, viewed the imminent defeat as a call for absolute destruction, executing radical directives that local commanders often let slide to avoid conflict with fanatical executioners. The chaos of the retreat provided the perfect cover for ideological zealots to turn their spite into physical ruin, far from the eyes of senior staff, who were more concerned with saving their armies from encirclement. These men used their remaining resources not to delay the enemy, but to inflict a lasting psychological scar on the territory they were forced to surrender. The advance was moving so quickly that a town could be peaceful one day and reduced to a historical wasteland the next, all before the frontline units even realized an engineering squad had been present. The American Third Army was pushing hard into the region, their scouts reporting empty roads and abandoned roadblocks, unaware that a final act of cultural obliteration had just been completed in the ancient town ahead. Captain Thomas Vance, 28, from Philadelphia, representing the advanced civil affairs team of the Third Army, walked up to the temporary field headquarters established in the local town hall. He carried a leather clipboard and a folder containing the engineer reports. He found the German commander sitting behind a wooden desk, calmly smoking a cigarette. Captain Vance looked at the German officer and placed his hand on his hip, near his sidearm. "We have inspected the town center," he said. "The cathedral is completely destroyed." SS Sturmbannführer Konrad Müller did not look up from his map. "It was an obstacle to our fields of fire," he answered. "Our engineers have examined the rubble," Captain Vance said. The demolition charges were placed inside the support pillars. There were no defensive positions nearby. You spent 12 hours rigging that building for collapse, while your men were supposed to be establishing a rear guard. Why did you blow up an 800-year-old sanctuary? Muller leaned back in his chair and blew a ring of gray smoke toward the ceiling. "Because it belonged to an era that is finished," he said. "You violated the international laws regarding cultural property." Captain Vance said, "There was no tactical justification for this act. Your own men have stated that you ordered the records burned and the altar broken before the main charges were detonated." "The old world is dying, Captain Vance," Muller said. "What we cannot hold, we destroy. The enemy inherits ruins. Your army wants to preserve these symbols of civilizational continuity, so you can rebuild your version of order. I chose to deny you that luxury. God does not need a building, and neither do the people of this town." "An old priest begged you to stop," Captain Vance said. "He stood outside and watched his life work turn to dust. He should be grateful he survived the blast," Muller said. A tailored sleeve shifted as he gestured toward the window. "We are the masters of this landscape, even in retreat. If we must leave, we will leave a desert. Your museums and your historians mean nothing to the Reich. This is not a matter for a local garrison," Captain Vance said. "You did not target a military asset. You targeted history itself." Muller smiled and tapped the ash from his cigarette onto the floor. "Then take your complaints to the Supreme Command, Captain. I have executed my orders, and I have no regrets. The ruins belong to you now." Captain Vance closed his folder and stepped back from the desk. He realized this situation went far beyond standard protocol. He turned to his sergeant and gave a brief instruction. "Hold him under maximum guard," Vance said. "Do not let him wash his uniform, and do not remove his boots. I am contacting headquarters immediately." The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate. 4 stars on his helmet, ivory, revolvers on his belt. The general walked into the town hall, unannounced. The room fell entirely silent as he walked toward the desk where the German officer stood. Patton did not raise his voice. He looked at the shattered limestone dust coating the floor, then turned his gaze directly to the prisoner. "Did you order the destruction of the cathedral?" Patton asked. "I did," Muller said. "It was an operational necessity to clear the advance of your armored columns." "Was there an American observation post in the steeple?" Patton asked. "No," Muller said. "Was there an ammunition dump in the crypt?" Patton asked. "There was not," Muller said. "So you used military engineering supplies to destroy an empty house of worship?" Patton said. Muller straightened his jacket. "I destroyed a symbol," he said. "The enemy inherits nothing but ruins. That is our philosophy of warfare." Patton studied him. His voice remained quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You stand here in a tailored uniform talking about philosophy," he said. "You call yourself a soldier, but you are an arsonist with an iron cross. You took a team of trained engineers and used them to erase 800 years of human achievement because you lacked the courage to face a real military advance. You think you are leaving a desert to prove your strength," Patton continued. "You think this rubble shows the power of your state. It does not. It shows your absolute bankruptcy. While you were rigging explosives to ancient pillars, A priest who spent 40 years serving this community was begging for mercy. He was protecting history. You were hiding behind gunpowder and spite. You have a choice, Patton said. Two options. Pick one in the next 10 seconds. You will either take your engineers into that rubble and clear every stone by hand under guard, or you will face immediate court-martial as a common vandal. Either way, you will live in the dirt you created. Decide now. Muller looked at the 4 stars on Patton's helmet, then down at his own polished boots. He remained completely silent, refusing to answer. Patton turned to Captain Vance. "He is finished talking," the general said. "Put the shovels in their hands." The engineers from the 3rd Army arrived at the ruins with 3 cargo trucks filled with standard military shovels, heavy iron crowbars, and empty canvas sandbags. Under the direct supervision of Captain Vance, a perimeter of armed guards locked the street, forcing the captured German demolition squad to step into the gray mountain of powder and stone. SS Sturmbannführer Konrad Müller stood at the base of the pile, his pristine leather boots sinking deep into the pulverized mortar that had held the cathedral together since the year 1200. The smell of burnt oak and lingering sulfur filled the damp spring air as the prisoners were ordered to begin lifting the broken blocks. Muller refused to move, staring straight ahead until a guard pressed the cold muzzle of an M1 rifle against his shoulder blades, forcing him to reach down and grasp a jagged piece of limestone. For 12 straight hours, the German officers labored alongside their men, their hands blistering and tearing against the sharp edges of ancient carved masonry. The local townspeople gathered along the perimeter lines in complete silence, watching the arrogant commander, who had promised them an inheritance of ruins, carry the heavy dust of their destroyed history on his own back. Father Heinrich Weber returned to the site of his former parish every day for the remainder of his life. He lived in a small wooden shack constructed at the edge of the cleared clearing, dedicating his remaining years to cataloging the fragments of limestone that the engineers managed to pull from the basement vaults. He never oversaw a full reconstruction of the grand structure, but he held services on a simple wooden table under the open sky until his death in 1962. Konrad Müller was transferred to an Allied prisoner of war facility before being handed over to a war crimes tribunal in Nuremberg. He was convicted of the deliberate and wanton destruction of cultural property without military necessity, serving 12 years in a federal prison before being released into relative obscurity. He returned to a changed Berlin, living in a small apartment and working as a quiet clerk until he passed away in 1984, leaving behind a series of private journals that expressed bitter resentment toward the army that had made him clear the rubble. General George S. Patton kept the engineering reports and the photographs of the destroyed cathedral in a black leather binder inside his traveling desk for the remainder of the European campaign. He mentioned the incident only once in a private letter to his wife, noting that a nation that destroys its own heritage out of sight has already admitted its total defeat. "I made them pick up their own mess," he wrote, "because a man who breaks history must be forced to feel the weight of the stones." Some historians have argued that Patton's decision to force senior German officers into physical labor was an emotional reaction that crossed the line from military justice into public humiliation. They suggest that forcing high-ranking prisoners of war into manual salvage work violated the spirit of traditional conventions regarding the treatment of officers. Others have argued the opposite, defending the action as a necessary and innovative enforcement of accountability for non-military destruction. They contend that because the cathedral possessed zero tactical value, its demolition was a war crime that stripped the perpetrators of standard battlefield privileges. What is certain is that Patton's swift mandate preserved the physical components necessary for future generations to catalog the historic site. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply forwarded the prisoner to the rear command for a standard military trial? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the evidence no order could erase, make sure to subscribe.